Blood stained the pavement as Adrian lunged forward. The screeching tires, the broken man beneath them, instinct overtook reason. In saving a stranger's life, homeless man saves Magnate's life became more than a fleeting headline. It became the key that unlocked the prison of his forgotten past. His hands trembled as royal blood revealed itself in sterile hospital light. The morning air bit through Adrian's threadbare coat as he huddled against the brick wall of Paddington Station, watching the endless stream of commuters with their coffee cups and briefcases, their lives moving with mechanical precision while his remained frozen in time. He'd long ago stopped counting the days since he'd last slept in a proper bed, stopped measuring his life against the conventional milestones that marked others' existence. Marriage, career, family, instead marking time by the changing of seasons, the rotation of shelter availability, and the shifting patterns of generosity from passers-by, who occasionally dropped coins into his weathered cap. The early November chill had settled into London's bones, promising a bitter winter ahead, one that Adrian knew would claim the lives of at least a few of his street companions who lacked his survival instincts or whose bodies had been too ravaged by illness, addiction, or age to endure another season of exposure. His stomach growled with familiar emptiness as he gathered his few possessions, a tattered backpack containing a spare shirt, a dog-eared paperback with half its pages missing, a plastic water bottle, and the blue wool blanket that had been gifted to him by a church volunteer last Christmas, and began his daily migration toward Covent Garden, where tourists might be feeling charitable. The weight of invisibility hung heavier than his backpack as he navigated through the morning crowd, bodies instinctively parting around him without eye contact, without acknowledgement, a human river diverting around an obstacle without conscious thought. Adrian had perfected his own invisibility over the years, learning to move through spaces without disturbing them, to exist in the margins where society preferred to keep its uncomfortable truths. It's homeless, it's mentally ill, it's addicted, it's unfortunate, out of sight and out of mind. The traffic light at the corner of Edgware Road turned green, and Adrian stepped onto the crossing with a handful of suited professionals, all staring at their phones or gazing ahead at the workday that awaited them. He was halfway across when the sound registered, tires screeching against wet pavement, an engine roaring with inappropriate acceleration, the collective gasp of pedestrians sensing danger before fully comprehending it. Adrian's head snapped toward the sound, his body already tensing with the heightened awareness that street life had ingrained in him. Survival instincts sharper than those of the well-fed, well-housed people surrounding him. A black sedan had run the red light and was barreling toward the crossing, its driver's face obscured behind tinted windows, its trajectory aimed directly at a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive overcoat who was obliviously checking his watch as death approached him at 40 miles per hour. What happened next occurred without conscious thought, a pure instinct born from Adrian's years of learning to react to danger without hesitation. He lunged forward, his body colliding with the suited strangers with enough force to send them both tumbling toward the opposite curb as the sedan screamed past, missing them by inches, close enough that Adrian felt the rush of displaced air against his face and heard the angry blare of the horn as the vehicle continued without slowing, disappearing around the corner with the squeal of tires. For a moment, everything was chaos, voices shouting, someone calling for an ambulance, the silver-haired man groaning beneath Adrian, blood seeping from where his head had struck the pavement. Adrian rolled off him, his own body aching from the impact, and found himself staring into the face of a man he recognized from newspaper headlines and television screens, Charles Harrington. The billionaire shipping magnate, whose empire stretched across continents, whose wealth was so vast, it seemed almost theoretical to someone like Adrian, who counted his worth in pennies and measured wealth by whether he'd eat that day. The world seemed to slow around them as Adrian registered the severity of the man's injuries. the gash at his temple pumping blood onto the wet pavement, the unnatural angle of his left arm, the shallow, labored breathing that suggested internal damage beyond what was visible. "Stay with me," Adrian found himself saying, surprising himself with the authority in his voice as he stripped off his outer shirt despite the cold and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure the way he'd learned during a brief stint at a homeless shelter where a volunteer nurse had taught basic first aid. "Help is coming. Keep your eyes open. Look at me, not at the blood." The billionaire's eyes, a startling blue that seemed almost artificial in their intensity, focused on Adrian's face with confusion, recognition slowly dawning that this disheveled, thin man had just saved his life at the risk of his own, a concept so at odds with the transactional world Charles Harrington inhabited that he seemed unable to process it even as consciousness began to slip away from him. The antiseptic smell of the hospital burned Adrian's nostrils as he sat awkwardly in a plastic chair, surrounded by the bustle of St. Mary's emergency department, his presence drawing suspicious glances from staff, who clearly wondered what a homeless man was doing in their pristine medical facility. He'd been ready to disappear after the ambulance arrived, to slip back into the anonymity of London's streets and continue his day's search for food and shelter, but a police officer had insisted he come to the hospital, partly to be checked for injuries, but mostly to give a statement about what he'd witnessed. Adrian's ribs ached where they'd collided with the pavement, and his right palm was scraped raw from breaking his fall. But these were minor inconveniences to someone accustomed to physical discomfort as a constant companion. A young doctor with kind eyes approached him, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally neutral, but unable to completely mask her reaction to his unwashed state and tattered clothing. "Mr. she began, leaving the question hanging in the air between them, a reminder that in the official world of forms and records, Adrian existed only as a blank space waiting to be filled. "Just Adrian," he replied, the absence of a surname, another marker of how thoroughly he'd been severed from conventional society, from the anchoring forces of family and history that tethered others to their place in the world. The doctor, Dr. Chen according to her name badge, nodded without judgment and began examining his injuries, her touch clinical but gentle as she cleaned the abrasion on his palm and asked him to lift his shirt so she could assess the bruising along his side, her fingers probing carefully for signs of broken ribs or internal bleeding. "You saved Charles Harrington's life today," she said conversationally as she worked, perhaps trying to put him at ease, perhaps simply filling the silence that stretched uncomfortably between them. The driver didn't stop. Police are calling it a hit and run, possibly deliberate, given Mr. Harrington's position. Adrian said nothing, uncomfortable with the suggestion of heroism in her tone, knowing that his action had been instinctive rather than noble, a reflexive response to danger rather than a conscious choice to risk himself for another. Dr. Chen continued, seemingly unperturbed by his silence. "He's in surgery now. Broken arm, concussion, some internal bleeding. But the head trauma could have been fatal if you hadn't acted so quickly. His security team is quite interested in speaking with you." The words "security team" sent a jolt of anxiety through Adrian, his body tensing beneath the doctor's hands, causing her to pause in her examination. In his experience, interactions with authority figures, police, security guards, even some social workers, rarely ended well for people in his position, often resulting in being moved along, questioned, or worse. Dr. Chen must have sensed his apprehension because she offered a reassuring smile as she applied a bandage to his palm. "Standard procedure for someone in his position," she explained. "They're not looking to cause trouble, quite the opposite. And they've arranged for you to be given a full workup while you're here. Blood tests, general health assessment. When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Adrian couldn't remember, Perhaps 3 years ago, when a particularly bad case of pneumonia had forced him to seek help at a free clinic, or maybe the time before that, when an infected foot wound had nearly cost him his limb. Time blurred on the streets, days bleeding into weeks, into months, with few distinct markers to separate them. Dr. Chen interpreted his silence as consent and proceeded to draw several vials of blood, explaining that they would check for anemia, infection, liver and kidney function. Standard tests, she assured him, though Adrian suspected there was nothing standard about the level of care being extended to him, a clear byproduct of his unexpected connection to a man whose net worth could probably purchase the entire hospital and everyone in it. The security men arrived while Adrian was picking at a hospital meal, his first proper food in days, their dark suits and earpieces marking them as clearly as his ragged appearance identified him, representatives of a world as foreign to Adrian as he was to theirs. They regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and respect that disoriented him, unused as he was to being seen at all, let alone viewed with something approaching deference. The older of the two, a barrel-chested man with close-cropped grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen combat, introduced himself as Garrison, head of security for the Harrington Group. "Mr. Harrington is out of surgery and asking for you," he said without preamble, his tone making it clear this was not a request but an expectation, another reminder of the power differential between the man Adrian had saved and himself. Adrian followed them through the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital, aware of the incongruity of his presence between these two polished professionals, aware too of the sideways glances from hospital staff and visitors who clearly wondered what business someone like him could have in the private wing, where the wealthy and influential received care, far removed from the crowded wards where ordinary citizens were treated. They passed through a security checkpoint where two more suited men stood guard, and into a private suite that resembled a luxury hotel room more than a hospital space. Thick carpet underfoot, tasteful artwork on the walls, a large window overlooking the London skyline, and at the centre of it all, Charles Harrington propped up in a hospital bed that had been adjusted to allow him to appear more dignified than most patients. The billionaire's face was pale beneath his tan, a white bandage covering the left side of his forehead, his left arm encased in a temporary cast while awaiting surgery, but his eyes were alert and focused as they settled on Adrian with an intensity that was almost physical in its force. "So you're the man who saved my life," he said, his voice stronger than his appearance would suggest. The voice of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Up close, Adrian could see the man was older than he'd appeared at a distance, perhaps in his mid-60s, with the trim physique of someone who paid handsomely for personal trainers and nutritionists. His silver hair expertly cut to frame a face that, while not conventionally handsome, projected authority and intelligence. "I understand I have a great deal to thank you for," Charles continued when Adrian remained silent, unsure of the appropriate response to this bizarre situation in which he found himself. Before Adrian could formulate a reply, the door to the suite opened and Dr. Chen entered, her expression troubled in a way that immediately put Adrian on edge, his street-honed instincts for detecting trouble activating in response to the tension radiating from her. She was accompanied by an older doctor whose bearing and the deference shown to him by the security men identified him as someone of importance. "Mr. Harrington," the older doctor began, then hesitated, his eyes flickering to Adrian with an expression that further heightened Adrian's sense that something significant was occurring. "We've received the preliminary results of the blood work we performed on Adrian. There's something highly unusual that we felt you should be aware of immediately, given your particular connections." Charles Harrington's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from gratitude to sharp interest. "Go on, Dr. Weston," he said, and Adrian noticed the security men had moved subtly, positioning themselves between him and the door, as if anticipating that he might bolt, which, had he been thinking clearly instead of caught in the surreal, dreamlike quality of the moment, might indeed have been his instinct. Dr. Weston cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he was about to reveal. As you know, your family maintains certain genetic markers in our private database for security reasons, among others. When we processed Adrian's blood work, the system automatically flagged a match, a very specific match to the Harrington-Rothwell line, particularly to the markers unique to your sister's children. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound in which Adrian could hear the blood rushing in his ears, could feel the world tilting beneath his feet as the doctor's words penetrated his consciousness. "That's impossible," Charles finally said, though his tone lacked conviction, his eyes now studying Adrian's face with an almost predatory intensity, searching for something he'd missed before. "My sister had 2 children, both accounted for. Unless—" He trailed off, his expression changing as some memory or realization struck him. Unless the rumors about Leopold were true, the timing would be right, about 30 years ago before his accident. The resemblance is there now that I look for it. Adrian felt his knees weaken, grateful for the chair behind him as he sank into it, trying to process information that seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone else's story. "I don't understand," he managed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, as if coming from the far end of a tunnel. Dr. Weston looked to Charles, who nodded once, granting permission for the doctor to continue. "According to your genetic profile," Dr. Weston explained gently, "you are the biological son of Prince Leopold of Rothwell, Mr. Harrington's brother-in-law, who died in a skiing accident 28 years ago. You are, in the simplest terms, royalty, and Mr. Harrington's nephew." The hotel suite provided by Charles Harrington felt like an alien landscape to Adrian, its opulence so at odds with his recent existence that he moved through it as if in a museum, afraid to touch anything, lest he leave a smudge of the street life he'd carried with him. The hot shower had been his first in months, the sensation of clean water cascading over his body, almost painful in its forgotten pleasure. The steam clearing not just the grime from his skin, but seeming to open pathways in his mind that had been blocked by the constant vigilance required for survival. He stood now before the full-length mirror in clothes that had been delivered while he bathed, simple but clearly expensive garments that fit him with uncanny precision, making him look like someone he didn't recognize, a stranger wearing his face, but not his history. 2 days had passed since the revelation in the hospital room, 2 days of medical tests and hushed conversations between Charles and his team of lawyers, doctors, and security personnel, 2 days in which Adrian had been transported from the periphery of society to its very center without having any say in the journey. The reflection staring back at him showed a man younger than he'd appeared on the streets, his true age, 32, according to the birth records that Charles's people had somehow located, visible now that the weathered mask of homelessness had been partially washed away. His hair, properly cleaned and cut by a stylist who had been summoned to the hotel, was a rich brown with hints of auburn that echoed, Charles had pointed out, the distinctive colouring of the Rothwell line, and his eyes, a striking grey-green that had appeared merely dull before, now showed the same unusual pigmentation as those in the photographs of Prince Leopold that Adrian had been shown, part of the mounting evidence of his impossible heritage. A knock at the door pulled him from his contemplation, and he opened it to find Garrison, who had become a constant presence, part bodyguard, part handler, part guide to the rarefied world Adrian was suddenly expected to navigate. "Mr. Harrington would like to see you in his study," the security chief said, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes betraying curiosity about the man who had so dramatically altered the power dynamics of his employer's world. Adrian followed him through the penthouse apartment where Charles was recovering from his injuries, a space that occupied the entire top floor of one of London's most exclusive addresses, its panoramic views of the city serving as a constant reminder of how far removed this environment was from the streets below, where Adrian had, until recently, made his home among the discarded and forgotten members of society. Charles sat behind a massive desk of polished walnut, his injured arm in a proper cast now, but otherwise looking remarkably recovered for a man who had nearly died less than a week ago, a testament to the quality of care available to those with unlimited resources. "Adrian, come in," he said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned across from him, his tone warmer than it had been in the hospital, but still carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "I imagine you have questions. God knows I have several myself. But before we get into all that, I wanted to show you something." He pushed a folder across the desk, its contents neatly labeled with official seals and legal terminology that Adrian couldn't fully decipher, despite the education he'd once had, before the streets had replaced academic concerns with more immediate needs. Inside the folder were documents that told a story Adrian couldn't remember living, a birth certificate from a private clinic in Geneva, Switzerland, listing his mother as Sophia Keller, a graduate student, and his father as unknown. Adoption papers transferring custody to a British couple, James and Margaret Foster, when he was just 6 weeks old. School records from a primary school in East London showing a bright but troubled child. And finally, a death certificate for the Fosters, killed in a car accident when Adrian was 9 years old. The paper trail ended there, though Charles filled in what he'd learned, that Adrian had entered the foster care system, bounced between homes until aging out at 18, after which official records became spotty, showing occasional employment, a brief military service that ended with an honourable discharge for medical reasons, and then nothing for the past 5 years. The period during which Adrian had gradually slipped through the cracks of society until the streets became his home. "Your mother was a doctoral student in international relations who had a brief affair with my brother-in-law during a diplomatic function," Charles explained, watching Adrian's face closely as he processed this information. "Leopold was already married to my sister at the time, a political match rather than a love match, but a scandal would have been damaging nonetheless. The family handled it quietly, as such things are handled in certain circles. Financial arrangements were made, the child, you, were placed with a suitable family, and life continued. When the Fosters died, the connection was lost. No one looked for you because no one knew to look." There was regret in his voice, though whether for the circumstances of Adrian's birth or for the years of hardship that followed was unclear. Adrian stared at the documents, trying to connect them to the vague, fragmented memories he carried. A woman's laugh, a man's hands teaching him to tie his shoes, the smell of a particular soap that he now realized must have been from his childhood home, sensory impressions that had survived when concrete memories had not. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked, looking up to meet Charles's gaze directly. "Why the hotel, the clothes, the investigators? I saved your life, yes, but this goes far beyond gratitude." The question had been gnawing at him since the hospital, the suspicion that Charles Harrington, billionaire businessman with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, was not a man given to sentiment or random acts of generosity without purpose. The London rain beat against the windows of the limousine as it glided through evening traffic. The rhythmic sweep of wipers creating a hypnotic pattern that Adrian found himself following to avoid the weight of Charles's gaze. They were en route to what Charles had described as a small gathering at his Belgravia home, though Adrian suspected that small in Charles Harrington's world likely meant something very different from what it would have meant in his previous life. The past week had been a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers who explained his potential claim to the Rothwell estate, substantial despite his illegitimate status due to the specific wording of Leopold's will and certain European inheritance laws. Sessions with tutors hired to refresh his knowledge of etiquette and current affairs, and medical appointments with specialists addressing the health issues caused by years of inadequate nutrition and exposure to the elements. "You're still uncomfortable with all this," Charles observed, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His tone not accusatory but matter of fact, the observation of a man accustomed to reading people as part of his business acumen. Adrian didn't respond immediately, watching raindrops race down the tinted window, each drop absorbing others as it traveled, growing larger, heavier, inevitable in its downward journey. "I've spent a decade becoming invisible," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "Learning how to move through the world without leaving a trace, how to need nothing and no one. Now I'm expected to step into the light, claim a heritage I never knew existed, become someone I don't recognize. Yes, I'm uncomfortable." Charles nodded thoughtfully, the gesture reminiscent of his sister, Adrian's biological aunt, whom he had met 3 days earlier in a tearful encounter that had left him emotionally drained, unprepared for the flood of connection to a blood relative after so many years of isolation. "The choice is yours," Charles said after a moment, though something in his tone suggested that he already knew what Adrian would decide, had perhaps engineered circumstances to lead to his preferred outcome. "You can walk away tonight if you wish, with enough money to start a new life anywhere you choose. My gratitude for saving my life guaranteed in financial form. Or you can step into the role you were born for, join the family business, reclaim your place in a world that should have been yours from the beginning." The offer hung between them as the limousine turned onto a tree-lined street where elegant townhouses stood like sentinels against the dreary London evening, their windows glowing with warm light that spoke of comfort, of belonging, of lives being lived in the certainty of their place in the world. Adrian felt the familiar tension in his chest, the tightness that came with enclosed spaces, with expectations, with the weight of other people's needs pressing against his carefully constructed defenses. For a decade, he had answered to no one, owned nothing that couldn't be carried, formed no attachments that couldn't be severed at a moment's notice. A life of ultimate freedom in its way, though most would see only its deprivations rather than its strange liberty. As the vehicle slowed to a stop before a particularly imposing residence, its facade illuminated by tasteful exterior lighting that highlighted its Georgian elegance, Adrian found himself thinking of the underpass near Waterloo Station where he had slept on nights when the weather was too harsh for his usual spots. The community of outcasts who gathered there with their shared code of respect for each other's space and possessions. The simple kindness of an older homeless man named Vic, who had once shared his carefully hoarded chocolate bar with Adrian when he was at his lowest point. That world, with its harsh realities but also its moments of unexpected grace, seemed impossibly distant now, separated from him not just by circumstance but by the blood that ran in his veins. Blood that connected him to palaces and boardrooms rather than underpasses and soup kitchens. The car door opened, held by a uniformed driver standing steady against the rain, and Charles exited first, turning back with an outstretched hand. Not physically needed, as Adrian was perfectly capable of exiting a vehicle unassisted, but symbolically significant, an invitation rather than a command. Adrian hesitated, balancing on the threshold between two worlds, between the man he had been and the man Charles Harrington believed he could become, between a past defined by survival and a future shaped by privilege. The rain fell steadily, indifferent to human decisions or destinies, washing the city clean for another day, while memory and possibility collided in Adrian's mind, demanding resolution, requiring choice. With a deep breath that carried the weight of years spent in the shadows, Adrian reached out and took his uncle's hand, stepping from the car onto the rain-slick pavement of a world he was only beginning to understand. The touch was brief but consequential, an acceptance of connection after so long without it, a silent acknowledgement that while the streets had shaped him, they need not define him. Charles's expression remained neutral, but satisfaction radiated from him as he led Adrian toward the imposing entrance where staff waited to receive them, to usher them into the warmth and light beyond. The door closed behind them with quiet finality, sealing Adrian's decision, committing him to a journey whose destination remained unclear, but whose first steps he had now irrevocably taken.